Freddy Krueger has been reworked once again. He might just be the #1 most reworked character in Dead by Daylight. In the 8 years since his release, he has gone through 3 completely different kits and has consistently troubled behaviour, who seemingly had no clue what to do with him. From the weakest killer in DBD history to the most reworked killer in DBD history, with various controversies sprinkled in between, Freddy has undoubtedly been a thorn in the dev's side ever since his debut in the game, which could be seen as payback for how awfully they treated him in his initial release 8 years ago on the 26th of October 2017. Freddy V1 was without a doubt the weakest killer that Dead by Daylight has ever seen, and there's a decent chance that we will never see another killer as weak as this ever again, which may come as a shock to those of you who have only ever seen his modern day version. And that is because his V1 kit was completely unrelated to his 2 post-rework versions, sharing practically 0 similarities with them whatsoever. Upon loading into the match, Freddy would find himself in the dream world with permanently impaired vision. Okay, so that's one thing that's still the same today, you may think. But no, when I say Freddy V1 had impaired vision, I mean he had seriously bad vision. What you've been seeing so far is modern day Freddy vision, and this is Freddy's V1 vision. Thick fog and glare cranked up to the max, god rays streaking across the screen, the skybox replaced entirely with pure white clouds alongside severe short-sightedness. That is what your vision would be like all game long, every single match if you played Freddy. The short-sightedness wasn't just a byproduct of all the previously mentioned effects either. The blur would take place in steps, ramping up in intensity depending on the distance from you, which made navigation, and more prominently, finding any hiding survivors, much more difficult. But enough about the permanent downside just for picking him. You finally found a survivor and earned your first hit. Actually, no you haven't, because Freddy V1 couldn't interact with awake survivors at all. You couldn't hit them, you couldn't grab them, you couldn't do anything at all, just watch. There was no passive sleep timer either, so they weren't going to fall asleep unless you did it yourself. Which means it's time to crack out Freddy's ability, Dream Demon. When you hold the ability button, Freddy holds out a dream scanner. This can point out nearby survivors even through thin walls at a close range. Although it can point people out through walls, you can't tag them unless you have direct line of sight and are very close to them. Tagging a survivor will cause them to start falling asleep. After 7 seconds have passed, the survivor will finally be asleep and Freddy is finally able to attack them. Considering how long it takes Freddy to earn the ability to simply attack a survivor, does that mean that this is a buffed attack of some sort? A one-shot? Longer lunge range? No, just a plain old regular basic attack, the same as the Trapper and everyone else. Okay, well, is the survivor slowed down or something? No, but Freddy is. Yep, after tagging a survivor with Dream Demon, Freddy is the one that gets slowed down, not the survivor. Although it doesn't make too much difference considering he can't hit them until they've fully fallen asleep anyway. And that's as far as his active ability goes. He gets permanently impaired vision, survivors get God mode against him, and all his ability does is remove the survivor's God mode after 7 long seconds. While that's it for his active ability, his real strength lies in his passive effects. When a survivor is asleep, they share the same poor visibility that Freddy has, alongside a whopping 50% reduction on repair speed, healing speed, totem cleansing speed, and door opening speed. This means that it would have taken a sleeping survivor an almighty 160 seconds to repair a generator. Freddy would also get permanent aura reading on any sleeping survivors outside of his terror radius. This combined to a weird scenario. If you were asleep, you'd rather have Freddy commit to chasing you than leave you alone, as in Chase, he had absolutely nothing he could do other than just walk at you. The Dream Demon Tagger did nothing to survivors who were already asleep, and none of his passive effects did anything at all during chases. But outside of chases, you'd have tremendously slow repair speeds, and you'd likely keep getting harassed by him every now and then due to his permanent aura reading. If survivors were forced to do effectively 10 generators worth of repairs, Freddy would have been one of the most OP killers in DBD history. But thankfully, survivors could wake up just like they do nowadays by either performing the wake up action on another survivor, failing any skill check, or getting hooked. There were no alarm clocks like there are today. So if Freddy did put you to sleep and then left you, your best bet was usually just to run to a gen and fail a skill check ASAP, as running around the map hunting for teammates would waste far more time than the 8 seconds worth of regression the failed skill check would cost you. So Freddy had a power that actively hurt his chase potential since survivors had 7 seconds of God mode, he had permanently obscured vision, and his only real strength, the gen slowdown, could be removed entirely in only a few seconds. By now, the realization of how truly useless old Freddy was is probably hitting you, because he most certainly isn't hitting you with those 7 seconds of God mode. While playing as Freddy was an absolute nightmare, pun intended, playing against him was absolutely incredible, and not just because of the crazy power trip it gave you. The original version of Freddy was so incredibly immersive to play against. You'd be working on a gen by yourself in the middle of nowhere, the match seeming suspiciously quiet before you'd notice the grass moving in the distance. Finally, an eerie lullaby begins to gradually get louder, and whatever is moving the grass is coming straight for you. You sneak off and hide in the corner as the grass keeps shuffling around you, and after a few intense moments, you suddenly see this segue to today's sponsor, Raycon. Enjoy a luxury listening experience at an affordable cost with the Raycon Everyday Earbuds. No matter what your day has in store for you, Raycon has your back with active noise cancellation to keep distractions at bay when you need to lock in and focus, or awareness mode for when you're going on a run and need to hear your surroundings alongside your music. With a whopping 32 hours of battery life alongside Raycon's quick charge function, giving you 90 minutes worth of battery in only 10 minutes of charging, they'll give you a good time for a long time. I'm obsessed with audio, as long-time viewers of my channel will know, and I've spent literally thousands on audio equipment, and I'm genuinely shocked at how impressive the Raycons sound at such an affordable price. Speaking of falling asleep, these earbuds are so small that they can sit flush in your ear so you can sleep comfortably and enjoy your ASMR in peace. Just be careful what lullabies you listen to. You wouldn't want to have a nightmare now, would you? Go to buyraycon.com/Ardetha to get 20% off the fan favorite everyday earbuds. Thank you again to Raycon for sponsoring this video. So Freddy would be completely invisible to any survivors who are awake, and your only way of knowing where he is would be from the sound of his lullaby and the grass shuffling beneath his feet. Pair that with all of his effects happening passively instead of actively, and you had a killer that confused the hell out of low-skilled players. While objectively, Freddy was borderline unplayable, low-skilled players struggled against him more than any other killer in the game, as during the match it never pops up anywhere saying, "You're asleep, fail a skill check to wake up," which did indeed mean that those players would either waste tons of time running around the map looking for a teammate to wake them up, or even worse, spend the entire match attempting to repair gens with that huge 50% repair speed debuff. Even with Freddy being awful during chases, low-skilled players struggled to loop whatsoever, and the addition of having to repair 10 generators worth of progress led to some horrendous matches. From here, what do you think these players did? Watch one single YouTube video on countering Freddy? Perhaps even read his ability description? No. Instead, they all flocked to Steam and review bombed the game, absolutely annihilating its Steam review score and putting the devs in some very hot water. Meanwhile, what were the more skilled players doing? The elite few trained in the ancient forbidden art of reading. They were enjoying literal God mode during chases against Freddy by simply pressing 2 buttons, left click and spacebar. You heard that right, it was possible to be completely God mode against this killer, not just for 7 seconds, but a potentially unlimited amount of time with 2 buttons. The whole skill check missing mechanic does make some sense when you think of generators, but this mechanic worked on all skill checks, including self-care. So what players would do is chase like normal until they eventually got injured, zip away with the on-hit burst, and then start self-caring while spamming the skill check button to instantly fail a skill check the frame it popped up, instantly waking themselves up again and disabling Freddy's ability to hit them. From here, Freddy would have to use Dream Demon again to put them to sleep, starting that 7-second timer once again. But failing a skill check during that 7-second timer instantly woke you up again, even though you still weren't fully asleep yet. This meant that, depending on your luck, it was entirely possible to literally stand still and spam the skill check button while self-caring and be completely untouchable for potentially the entire match. I'm not gonna lie, with skill check RNG, it would be unlikely that you'd be able to achieve a constant flow of failed skill checks for permanent God mode, but it wasn't impossible. However, What did work consistently was looping like normal and spamming the skill check button while the killer was stuck in an animation, such as breaking pallets as you can see in this background footage, which was still incredibly powerful. What's even crazier is that back then, self-care was the #1 most used survivor perk in the game, especially for lower skill players, which meant that most of the people review bombing the game had this perk on and could have used this tactic at any time. But no, I guess Freddy was just too OP. It's also worth noting that he was bugged to have a slower vault speed than any other killer in the game, just to serve as the cherry on top. With this onslaught of negative reviews potentially jeopardizing Behavior's income, they had to react. What would their move be? Nerf the weakest character the game has ever seen? Add some kind of tooltip or icon in the match so players know what they're supposed to do? Only 2 weeks after Freddy's release day, we would have our answer, with a whole host of Freddy-related changes. Nerf. Freddy now only sees the auras of sleeping survivors once they've been outside of his terror radius for 10 seconds instead of the previous 1 second, nerfed by 10 times. Nerf. Increased Freddy's terror radius from 16 meters to 24 meters, a nerf of 50%. Nerf. Increased the amount of time Freddy is slowed after putting a survivor to sleep from 1 second to 3 seconds, tripled his slow. Nerf. Any revived slugs are instantly woken up. A wombo combo of nerfs for the killer who can't kill. This is the state that V1 Freddy would be left in for over a year and a half, only ever getting very tiny quality of life changes and bug fixes, like the aforementioned vault speed bug. Things needed to change. Finally, on the 23rd of July 2019, in patch 3.1.0, we would see him completely reworked into Freddy V2, with a brand new kit that shared barely any similarities with the original. Rework. Survivors now passively fall asleep after a long time, with the timer visible on the HUD, or fall asleep the second Freddy hits them. The dream world's visibility has been drastically improved. Most notably, Freddy is no longer short-sighted. Freddy can now fully interact with awake survivors like any other killer. Being awake instead grants survivors with complete immunity to his new active ability. Being asleep no longer reduces repair speed, heal speed, cleansing speed, and door opening speed. Added a new method of waking up, alarm clocks. A sleeping survivor will be designated one alarm clock, and its aura will be permanently visible to the survivor until they wake up, giving players an in-game indication of how to wake up. New active ability, dream snares. Freddy can place a small circle on the floor, which primes after a few moments. If a sleeping survivor steps on it, they get slowed. New active ability, dream pallets. If using certain add-ons, he loses the ability to use dream snares and instead is granted dream pallets, which are fake pallets he can place around the map to trick sleeping survivors. New secondary ability, dream projection. After a long cooldown, Freddy can teleport to any generator that hasn't been completed. Freddy is now visible to awake survivors like any other killer, instead having his visibility flicker intermittently when at a decent distance away, alongside a huge add-on overhaul. This rework was a huge improvement over the original, with his ability now being much more telegraphed and easier for survivors to tell what's going on, waking up no longer granting God mode, and the alarm clock serving as an in-game indication of how to wake up. When these changes first came through, most of the community deemed Freddy V2 as surprisingly strong. Not Nurse and Blight level of strong, but stronger than the majority of the roster since the snares were a nice anti-loop tool. However, this opinion didn't last long, as the community learned how to play against him, treating him somewhat similarly to the clown, playing safely and dropping pallets early. This caused the general community's opinion of him to place him around the same level as the clown. That being, not awful, but certainly not strong. On the topic of the clown, let's compare the two abilities. The clown's gas slows survivors by 15% as long as they're in the cloud, lingering for an additional 2 seconds once they left. Freddy's snares also slowed survivors by 15% as long as they were in the snare, but lingered for 3 seconds once they left, which on paper sounds like a straight up improvement over the clown, not even mentioning the teleport, which already gave him better map pressure than the clown too, but that's just on paper. In reality, Freddy's snare actually amounted to a weaker version of the clown's gas, which was already a fairly weak ability as it is, for 2 reasons. The first of which was reliability. The clown's gas activated very quickly, covered a large area, and could cover an even bigger area by simply smashing the bottles on something high up, potentially making the entire loop covered in gas. This meant that the slow could potentially last for up to a whopping 12 seconds. Freddy's snares, however, can only be placed at a shorter distance, took around 5 seconds to arm once placed, and covered just a tiny spot on the floor. Even if you kept doubling back and forced the survivor to stay stood on the snare for its entire duration, it would dissolve after a measly 3 seconds, giving you a maximum theoretical duration of 6 seconds. But again, it only covers a tiny spot, so realistically, survivors will leave the area the moment they activate it, landing you nearer to that 3-second mark. The second reason is add-ons. The clown's add-ons were so much more impactful than Freddy's. Pretty much every single clown uses bleach, which increased the slow to an almighty 20%, and there were various other noteworthy add-ons like ether 15 volume percent, which increased the slow duration by another second, or makeup kit, which made the gas cover an even bigger area and linger for even longer. What this meant was that Clown would often be slowing survivors by 20% for at least 5 seconds, whereas Freddy had no add-ons that did anything of the such. No matter what, he would be slowing them by a smaller percentage for a shorter amount of time, if they were asleep. If they were awake, however, he once again had no chase ability at all. They would be 100% immune to both snares and dream pallets, leaving his teleport as his only consistent ability. Speaking of dream pallets, if snares are so bad, then why not bring dream pallets instead? Well, instead of a fairly weak effect, many times dream pallets would end up having no effect. You see, like snares, dream pallets didn't work on the survivor if they were awake, but oftentimes they also didn't work on the survivor if someone else was awake. While a sleeping survivor had no way of telling whether a pallet was real or fake, an awake survivor would only see real pallets, and if they were survivor friends, they could simply call out which pallets were real and which ones were fake. But even if the dream pallets did trick someone, they didn't really benefit Freddy much. The pallet would simply vanish as the survivor dropped it, no damage or slow applied after the fact. This meant that realistically, dream pallets effectively served as a tiny slow effect, that being the survivor's dropping animation, which is about half a second. Counterplay against the dream pallets was also fairly simple. Instead of dropping early like with snares, you instead just W key and go for distance, only really dropping a pallet if you're about to be hit anyway, since you have nothing else to lose. Eventually, once the dust had settled, the community's opinion of his power dropped even further, with people viewing him as even weaker than the clown, now being amongst some of the worst killers in the game. Not the worst by any means, but definitely weak. Truthfully, he wasn't awful when he worked, but there were so many different scenarios where he simply had no abilities. He was just far too unreliable and inconsistent. Things still needed to change. So, 2 years after this rework, in patch 4.7.0, on the 4th of May 2021, Freddy would receive some more changes. Nerf. Freddy now gets slowed by 15% while placing a snare. Nerf. Freddy now only gets a maximum of 5 snares instead of the previous 8. Nerf. Freddy now only gets a maximum of 7 dream pallets instead of the previous 10. Nerf. After waking up using an alarm clock, survivors' sleep timers are paused for 30 seconds. They are also immune to Freddy manually putting them to sleep via hitting them for 30 seconds too. Freddy had been shafted once again. As I'm sure you can imagine, this didn't help the community's already sinking opinion of this character. The most shocking part of the nerf is the addition of him slowing himself while placing a snare, as back in the day, the original version of the clown also slowed himself every time he threw a bottle, and was absolutely awful because of it, so it was removed very quickly. And here we have Freddy, who was just a worse version of the clown, getting nerfed to have the very same self-slow. While it wasn't instant, the overall community slowly but surely started placing him even lower in tier lists once again, until eventually we found ourselves back to square one once again, with frequent claims of Freddy being the worst killer in the game, just like he used to be. I don't personally think Freddy v2 was as bad as some of the other killers like Myers for example, but many people did. It was a whole 7 years after his initial release, but things still needed to change. So, 3 years and 7 months after his last round of nerfs, on the 8th of January 2025, he would receive another full-on rework, bringing him into Freddy v3. This one would share some of the core themes and concepts as the previous iteration instead of starting completely from scratch, but despite sharing all of the same names, the abilities function completely differently to Freddy v2. Rework. Freddy now has access to both snares and dream pallets at the same time, and can switch between them at will during the match. Dream snares are now a moving projectile. Dream pallets are now clearly distinguishable from real pallets and are also visible to awake survivors. Dream pallets can now stun Freddy. However, they can now also be detonated, exploding and dealing one state of damage to nearby sleeping survivors. Awake survivors are still immune to Freddy's abilities, but hitting them with either of them will add progress to their sleep timer. Freddy will passively get killer instinct anytime a sleeping survivor is being healed. He can also teleport directly to them. Increased the amount of available dream pallets from 7 to 8. Freddy can now teleport to fully completed gens and also gets killer instinct for a few moments after teleporting. Survivors can now use any alarm clock to wake up instead of having one specific alarm assigned to them. Increased the slow duration on snares from 3 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Decreased the slow intensity on snares from 15% to 12%, alongside another add-on overhaul. This rework was yet again another huge improvement over the previous version, making him a bit more versatile and giving him an incentive to actually use his abilities on awake survivors, since it will cause them to sleep sooner. Dream pallets now pose a genuine threat as they can actually deal damage. While this is fairly easily avoidable, it still has potential as a zoning tool which could end up causing hits regardless. Snares are now much more reliable, much less clunky, and no longer require a priming time. While their slow duration has been increased considerably to 4.5 seconds, the slow intensity being nerfed is a little bit odd as they were already outperformed by clown gas. But by far, the most contentious change is his ability to detect and teleport to any sleeping survivors being healed due to concerns of it encouraging tunneling or slugging. But it could also cause a big problem for low skill survivors who won't understand why he's suddenly appearing next to them. At the time of making this video, Freddy v3 is still a very new addition to the game and the dust has not settled yet. That being said, it seems like people are kind of over this rework already. His pick rate has plummeted once again back to a more normal rate, and while that is to be expected, it doesn't normally happen so soon after a big rework. Normally at this point, we'd still be seeing tons of people picking the new fresh rework, but we're not. For once, we're going to talk about the future instead of the past. How is this rework going to settle? For the first couple of weeks, the exploding pallets had some people worried, but it seems like most of those worries have subsided. From the way things are looking, Freddy v3 is an undeniable improvement over v2, but people's opinion of him isn't as sky high as it was when v2 initially released. Speaking of which, my prediction is that over the upcoming months or possibly years, his placement will gradually drop off again. Don't get me wrong, I don't think he'll reach anywhere near as low of a spot as he did previously, but people are definitely overvaluing him while he's new. The biggest reason for that is that snares are still his main source of chase pressure, and while they're much more reliable and easily confirmable than before, I'm still not sure that they're as good as clown gas, especially with the reduced slow intensity. Yes, they increased the slow duration to be more in line with the clowns, but again, every clown uses bleach, which now gives him a 19% slow, and he's still not a strong killer, let alone Freddy's only being 12%. Of course, unlike the clown, Freddy also has dream pallets to assist him alongside the snares. So, who knows? Once the community has figured him out, maybe he'll be a formidable force. That being said, this is still an amazing rework that has undoubtedly made him stronger, feel better to play as, and increased the number of options he has available to him.